Hello, welcome to a series of online conversations with practitioners in the visual arts. In is broadcast by New Local Space, NLS, a contemporary art initiative in Kingston, Jamaica, and a subsidiary of audio production house Creative Sounds. This morning, I'm chatting with Kelley-Ann Lindo, who is currently artist in residence here at NLS. Kelly received her BFA in painting from the Edna Manley College of the Visual and Performing Arts in 2015. Her work was recently included in the 2017 Jamaica Biennial at the National Gallery of Jamaica, as well as the digital exhibition, which was also at the National Gallery of Jamaica. And she recently completed a residency at Alice Yard in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago in 2016. And her work has been reviewed in the Huffington Post and Hyperallergic recently. Hi, Kelly. Thank you for taking a break from the studio to have a chat on In.
Hi, Deborah. Thanks for having me.
What are you working on now during these weeks of the residency? You've been in residence for about 9 weeks now. What have you been working on?
Well, I've been sort of looking at some of the contents that people send in barrels in the Caribbean. It's an expansion of the Send Love in a Barrel project that I did at Alice Yard last year.
Tell us a little bit about the Send Love in a Barrel project.
Well, that project really was looking at how people communicate through barrels. And it really, it came about during the residency where I spent a lot of time engaging with a lot of the artists there. Yeah, the project was in the biennial, as you mentioned before. The response I got from it here was a lot different than in Trinidad, actually. So that was pretty interesting too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what are some of the materials, both physical and otherwise, that you're employing in your project now during your residency? And how are you using them technically, physically?
One of the materials I'm using are tin cans, which I've been sourcing over the past few weeks. They sort of, to me, represent some of the nutritional substances that people would send that you'd find in the cans themselves, and they also sort of serve the same purpose as these barrels themselves. Some other materials that I'm using. I'm using sort of video. I'm working on some video works, and they're sort of trying to. I'm using them to try to. Sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's trying to decode some of the messages that you would find that these families are trying to communicate with their families in the Caribbean.
From outside of the Caribbean. So families sending products for families residing outside of the Caribbean, sending items to their family within the Caribbean.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for the most part, those are two of the main materials that I'm using.
So you speak about communication, and Stuart Hall, who conducted a lot of scholarship on the formulation of identity in Black diasporic communities, argued that one, meaning is not simply fixed or determined by the sender of a message. Also, that the message is never transparent, and finally, that the audience is not a passive recipient of meaning. Of course, in his arguments, he's speaking about TV or film as the vehicles for such messages. But in your work, you are using or considering the barrel for those purposes. What are some of the? I mean, how do you think about concepts of encoding and decoding between the diaspora and home with what you're working on right now with the barrel?
Well, it really does sort of relate to his ideas and theories behind, particularly when he said that the message is never transparent. and that meaning, meaning is never fixed. Families overseas, they send these barrels in hopes that um, their families who are on the receiving end would understand that they're sending these material things to sort of show them in a way that they love and care for them. And for me, I think that's sort of the message um, that they're basically trying to send. Uh, the person on the receiving end may not necessarily understand very clearly what the message is, which I think it was the same thing that Stewart was trying to say. In that, for instance, can I give an example?
Yes, sure.
So a friend of mine, um, who I met in Trinidad, she expressed her feelings about her mother, um, who had migrated from Trinidad for a few years, and she would receive these barrels from her mother, and there was a level of anger towards her mother actually, because her mother was never there, but the barrels were, and she'd send things that she may not necessarily like, because it's almost like her mother didn't really know her. So in the sense, the message that her mother probably was trying to say to her, that look, I love and care for you, she may not have seen that message in that way,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm making
Yeah,
sense.
definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. What are, I mean, do you think that those are, though, that message, I love you, or you think that's where the communicative needs of barrels ends? Is it, or do you think that it's a more complex scenario that sort of informs what gets put inside of the barrels? Like,
I think it's definitely more complex than just simply being, hey, I love you. It's a bit more complex than that, because I myself have never packed a barrel, but in using my own experiences, I'm sure my mother, when she was sending these barrels, she wasn't may not well, she may not have known exactly what it is I liked, and I'm sure there's that sort of um, discussion that they're having with themselves.
or even anxiety maybe about what to put inside of the barrel.
Right, a lot of questions of, are they going to like this? Is this something that they're going to use? So I think it's not easy on either ends. I think it's a really complex scenario. It's a complex situation that everybody faces in the Caribbean. It's a huge part of our culture.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I know I've just had I've had studio visits with you, so I know that part of your work is deconstructing what gets packed inside of the barrels. What are some of the things that you've observed as you've just sort of taken a closer look, but also maybe stood back, put a little bit of distance between your personal experiences? What are some of the things you've discovered as you deconstruct what's in a barrel?
I realize that people tend to send some as it relates to food stuff, they
Mhm.
tend to send the same things. So it's almost like the script. You'll never see a barrel and not see Irish ring soap. You'll never see a barrel and not see unmarked or unlabeled tissue paper or tissue rolls.
Mhm.
There's always like the traditional, traditional quote unquote, spam, peanut butter in one jar,
Mhm.
um, Kellogg's cornflakes, pink salmon. That's something that
Always see.
always see. So somewhere, those are some of the things, and then you'd have like you know clothes. Usually some of the latest fashion clothes, but more than anything else, it's usually the food stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
like things needed for sustenance and
Right.
just like basic survival. W- Um, is there any so we mentioned Stuart Hall and this whole idea of encoding and decoding, but is there other writing that you've had or other reading that you've had a chance to do during the residency that has informed like how you think about the project or could give us some insight into how you're thinking?
Yeah, there are a few novels that I've been reading, but particularly uh it it's more of an article, well, a blog in a sense. I don't remember her name off the top of my head right now, but she started the Barrel Story Project.
The Barrel Story Project.
Right, where people from the Caribbean or barrel children, they sort of tell their story. And I've been reading a lot about it and I've been listening because they have on SoundCloud as well. If you type in barrel stories, you'll find it. I've been listening to a lot of the stories. And a lot of what I've heard have sort of made me understand a little bit more about how I feel as it relates to, um, when barrels are being sent, or about even my own situation with my parents and them, um, not being here. Um, and then there's also an artist I was looking at. Her name is Lucy Sparrow. It has nothing, conceptually, nothing to do with what I'm looking at, but it's just the way in which she approaches her work. She does a lot of installations using felt. So she recreates sort of realistic food items from like shops, using a lot of bright colors, which kind of inspired me with some of the cans that I've been looking at and some of the colors that I wanted to introduce.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um, I guess you're thinking, what is that palette like? I mean, I know that we're a podcast, but sometimes I like to give people visual cues. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what are some of what is the palette that you're referring to?
Well, I've been exploring. I typically don't use a lot of color in my works, so it's a little bit new for me. I'm using a lot of oranges and a lot of yellows and pinks, um, because it does sort of tie back to our emotions of people who are receiving barrels. It also does tie back to some of the materials that you'd find in these barrels. Um, so I think the colors sort of resonated with me. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of answers your question,
Yeah.
but
It's giving me a little bit of clue. What are some of the emotions um that you hope the palette would evoke?
well, excitement for one,
Mm-hmm.
and a little bit of anxiety, um, a little bit of skepticism in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of my work usually I tend to create experiences for people, or I attempt to create experiences for people, and I want to sort of allow the viewer to try and experience or have that experience of what it would have been like for those who have never received a barrel,
Mm-hmm.
to understand what that feels like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Um, as our audience may have guessed if they haven't seen your work before, your work your work is sculptural and also conceptual and can be quite minimal, as you just hinted at with in terms of even your palette in its aesthetic. How do you intend for the work to operate with its audience? um if you could give us an idea of the previous projects, how the audience would have interacted with those, and maybe how those considerations you think will inform the work that you're doing now.
Well, like I said before, a lot of my work, the whole intention is to create an experience. So even with the Sun Love in a Barrel project, that installation, it needed two people to activate it. If you haven't seen it, or if anybody else hasn't seen it, it's literally, well, in the biennial, it consisted of about four shipping barrels, with two chairs on either end, and it invited persons to sit on either side of the barrels and communicate with each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it created a space, where people were able to, in that moment, sort of communicate and understand and sort of relive the experience of communicating with one another over a distance
Through the barrel.
through the barrels, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in essence, that I'm still trying to accomplish that, create an experience for the viewer, and in turn have them bring their experiences to the work and create a meaning for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You're still a very young artist, and you are a recent. You just recently finished art school 2 years ago. So I would imagine you're still working through what your process is, right? But how would you describe your working process thus far? And how does a project start, and how does it develop for you?
Frustrating, very frustrating. Um, because my process usually starts, well, through research initially, um, but it also leads me to a place where, after I've done the research and I've sort of figured out what it is I want to do, or what it is I want to look at or further investigate, um, I then try to figure out how I'm going to do this thing, how I'm going to create this visual language, and that's where the frustration comes in, because I have a tendency to sort of overthink a lot of things, and I yeah, I have this strong tendency to overthink a lot of things. So I will do more than one exploration. So I'd have probably even like 20 different explorations. And it then gets really overwhelming for me, because I'm now forced to sort of take a lot of things away. And I'm still learning how to do that, understanding that less is more,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Yeah.
Yeah. Most of the work, now that you mentioned that, most of the work in Jamaica, even contemporary art, is based in traditional media, as opposed to, say, the found materials that you've been using. And aesthetically, I would also say that the majority of work being made by artists now is probably the exact opposite of minimalism. What has it been like for you to be working the way you do outside of these norms, and as a young artist?
Um, well, definitely challenging. Um, Simply because a lot of the times, some of the materials that I use, as you said, they're very unconventional. And there's the question, I'm faced with the question of, are they, what it is that you're using, or is this actually art? Or you know if for example, at the biennial, I had someone come up to me and was asking me if this is art, and why do I have filthy barrels in the gallery,
National Gallery. Mm-hmm.
in the National Gallery, and if this is what art has come to.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I was offended for a bit, but then I was just like, you have a lot of ignorant people out there, and I'm not gonna stop using found objects, because really and truly, there's nothing like knowing you have materials on hand whenever you need it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All this started when I was in my final year, or even before my final year. Actually, I had no money to buy materials.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, why not, go into the skip You know, anybody who goes to Edna knows what the skip is. That's where they dump a lot of the garbage and everything,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where we'd go to find materials.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so I've been working like that for a while, and it can be a bit challenging, but at the same time fulfilling.
Yeah, and certainly testing or challenging your level of inventiveness and
Right.
and ingenuity.
Yeah.
Which again sort of speaks to the lived reality of Jamaica, right? Like if you go across, if you just take a brief journey through the landscape in Jamaica, you see it reflected everywhere in how we live, like how things are constructed, all of that.
Right. And what better way to create an experience for somebody by actually giving them something that they can resonate with, something that they are familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you always worked conceptually, or yeah, conceptually? Have you?
I'd say so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How has your practice and your work developed since you graduated from Edna?
Um, I'd say that I'm still learning to make better choices and to sort of communicate my ideas in a more sophisticated manner than I was in art school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you mean about making better decisions? Like what would you consider to be what,
In terms of uh choosing the right materials and knowing how to articulate my ideas more effectively. Um, you know, I was terrified, I still am, but back in school when we have critiques, that was probably one of the worst moments for me. Being, having to explain my work, and I think that I've gotten a little bit better at that, and I'm still learning.
what would you what would you how do you know when you found the right materials? You say you know you're working through how to choose your materials.
Mhm.
How do you know when a material is right for the work that you're doing?
It has a lot to do with the idea. Um, because for me, if I'm working through an idea, I need to have the material itself need to be able to speak without me being there.
Mm-hmm.
So you should be able to look at the work and sort of understand what's happening without needing someone to sort of, or needing me to explain to you what is happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or have it function. I mean, or have it like sort of illustrated for you. As
Right.
you've had a very active time since you've graduated from Edna, between your recent participation in the biennial and your residency at Alice Yard last year. And now I understand you've been accepted to a number of grad schools.
Mhm.
Which school are you considering?
Well, I'm highly considering Goldsmith, and Glasgow School of Art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. What has been the biggest challenge for you as a visual artist in the 2 years since you graduated? And I, I guess this is for even younger artists than yourself. How have you dealt with the challenges thus far? Has community been a part of this?
Well, I think the biggest challenge for me, Deborah, has been sort of trying to find a balance between um, living life, or everyday life, trying to pay bills, stuff like that, being on my own, and
Survival.
right, and having time to work
Mm-hmm.
on my practice. And I think that was one of the biggest fears for me, even when I was at art school. Um, I had a fear of, when I left, will I be able to continue working? And I was afraid that I would not have that inclination to create work, but I still do, and I'm very happy for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, how have you dealt with this whole challenge of, like, as you said, the day-to-day things that you must do to survive, and then keeping up a creative practice?
Well, I've been lucky. I have a lot of people in my life who have been pushing me. Um, Artists, who have been behind me and um, let me know that I need to sort of keep pushing and keep going. I've done a number of odd jobs since I've left school. Um, but I think the main thing is telling myself that I'm not stopping. I'm gonna keep going. I didn't go to school for 4 years to come out and not do art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What would you recommend to, firstly, students who are entering Edna Manley in their first year, and then to artists who are graduating from Edna? What would you be your advice to each? It could be two separate pieces of advice, but
I'd say keep working. That's the main thing. I'd say keep working and be open. Be open to new experiences and be open to communicate. And also that everything is only for a moment. Like I took that from my mentor, um, Ebony. She keeps saying that to me. Everything is only for a moment, and you can look at that in any way that you choose.
mm-hmm,
If you're going through a hard time, just know that it's not going to last forever. It's
mm-hmm,
only for a moment. And if you feel like you can't make art, you can't continue making art, just know that it will pass.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's some great advice to you from Ebony, and that's Ebony Patterson.
Yes.
Um, Kelly has a public open studio coming up on Sunday, August 13th. So come by and check out what she's been working on. We look forward to seeing you there, seeing the regular faces, meeting new ones. Kelly, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.